What if I told you that a simple whistle, a brief moment of teenage bravado, could trigger a chain of events that would shake an entire nation to its core? What if a 14-year-old boy's innocent gesture would not only cost him his life, but ignite a revolution that changed America forever? Today, we're diving deep into one of the most horrifying and transformative moments in American history. A story so brutal, so shocking, that when the world finally saw the truth, it couldn't look away. This isn't just another tale from the dark chapters of segregation. This is the story of Emmett Till and how his murder became the catalyst that awakened a sleeping giant. But here's what most people don't know. The official story you learned in school, it barely scratches the surface. The real truth behind Emmett's death involves layers of conspiracy, cover-ups, and a judicial system so corrupt that it would make your blood run cold. The woman at the center of this tragedy would carry a secret for over 60 years, a lie so devastating that when she finally confessed, it reopened wounds that many thought had healed. You think you know this story? You don't know anything yet. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Emmett Till's name became synonymous with injustice, and why his mother's decision to show the world her son's mutilated body sparked a movement that would reshape the very fabric of American society. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. This story needs to be told, and these conversations need to happen. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think about how one moment can change history forever. The year was 1955. America was riding high on post-war prosperity, suburban dreams, and the promise of the American way of life. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. Television sets were becoming common in middle-class homes, showing families gathered around dinner tables, children playing in manicured lawns, and a vision of progress that painted the nation in bright, optimistic colors. In the South, a complex social order had been carefully constructed and maintained for nearly a century. The Jim Crow laws weren't just legal guidelines, they were an entire way of life, a social contract that everyone understood, even if they didn't agree with it. Separate but equal wasn't just a legal doctrine, it was supposed to be a peaceful solution to racial tensions, a way for two worlds to coexist without conflict. White communities in places like Mississippi's Delta region lived in a bubble of perceived safety and tradition. Small towns like Money, Mississippi, population barely 400, operated like extended families where everyone knew everyone, where social hierarchies were as natural as the changing seasons. The local grocery stores, cotton fields, and community gatherings all functioned according to unspoken but ironclad rules about who could go where, speak to whom, and how interactions should unfold. For white families, this system provided predictability and control. Children grew up understanding their place in the world, secure in the knowledge that certain boundaries would never be crossed. The Bryant family, who ran a small grocery store in Money, were typical of this community. Roy Bryant, a store owner and part-time trucker, had married Carolyn, a young woman who embodied the Southern belle ideal. She was pretty, soft-spoken, and understood her role in maintaining the social fabric that kept their world intact. Black families in the same region lived under a completely different reality, but one that had its own unspoken agreements. Parents raised their children with an acute awareness of invisible lines that must never be crossed. Survival depended on understanding the complex dance of deference, The careful choreography of lowered eyes, appropriate tone of voice, and physical positioning that could mean the difference between a normal day and a life-threatening encounter. The Tills lived in Chicago, where Emmett's mother Mamie had moved from Mississippi years earlier, seeking the opportunities and freedoms that the North promised. Like thousands of other Black families, they had participated in the Great Migration, leaving behind the suffocating restrictions of the South for cities where their children could attend integrated schools, where they could vote without fear, and where the constant threat of violence was significantly reduced. Emmett Till was a typical 14-year-old boy, full of energy and confidence that came from growing up in Chicago's more liberated environment. He was popular with his friends, a bit of a show-off, and like many teenagers, he sometimes spoke before thinking. His mother had raised him to be proud and self-assured, qualities that served him well in the North, but would prove dangerous in the very different world of the South. When summer came in 1955, Emmett was excited about visiting his relatives in Mississippi. For a city kid, the rural South represented adventure, wide-open spaces, and the chance to connect with extended family he rarely saw. His mother was hesitant, knowing the dangers that awaited her confident, outspoken son in a place where the rules were so different from what he knew. But this wasn't just about one family's decision to send their son south for the summer. This was about two entirely different Americas existing side by side with completely different understandings of how the world worked. And when these two worlds collided on August 24, 1955, the explosion would be heard around the globe. The morning of August 24th started like any other summer day in the Mississippi Delta. The heat was already building by sunrise, promising another scorching day that would drive people indoors by afternoon. Emmett Till had been staying with his great-uncle Moses Wright for several days, getting used to the rhythms of rural life, the slower pace, and the different social dynamics that governed every interaction. But here's where the official story begins to unravel, where the carefully constructed narrative starts showing cracks that reveal something far more sinister underneath. The truth is, what happened at Bryant's grocery store that day wasn't just a case of teenage ignorance meeting Southern racism. It was the collision of two entirely different realities, and the aftermath would expose just how fragile the supposed peace of segregation really was. Emmett and several local boys had gone to the store to buy candy and soda. For the local kids, this was routine, but they understood the unwritten rules that govern such interactions. Look down, speak only when spoken to, count out your money carefully, say yes ma'am and no ma'am, and leave quickly. For Emmett, used to the casual interactions of Chicago's integrated neighborhoods, these elaborate social protocols seemed unnecessary and even ridiculous. What happened next depends on who's telling the story, but here's what we know for certain. Emmett Till, a Black teenager from Chicago, had some kind of interaction with Carolyn Bryant, a white woman working alone in her family's store. The accounts vary wildly, but they all agree on one crucial point. Whatever happened, it violated the most sacred taboo of the Jim Crow South. Some witnesses said Emmett whistled at Mrs. Bryant as he left the store. Others claimed he made inappropriate comments or gestures. Carolyn Bryant herself would later testify that he grabbed her hand, made verbal advances, and behaved in a threatening manner. But here's the shocking truth that wouldn't emerge for another 60 years. Much of her testimony was a lie, a fabrication that would cost a child his life and traumatize a nation. The real horror wasn't just what happened in the store, it was what happened afterward, when word spread through the white community like wildfire. In the carefully controlled world of 1950s Mississippi, this kind of incident couldn't be allowed to stand. It wasn't just about one woman's honor or one boy's behavior. It was about maintaining the entire system of control that kept the racial hierarchy in place. Roy Bryant, Carolyn's husband, was out of town when the incident occurred. When he returned and heard the story, he faced a choice that would define him forever. In his community, there was really only one acceptable response. The social pressure wasn't subtle, it was absolute. To let this slide would be to admit weakness, to acknowledge that the boundaries everyone depended on were actually meaningless. But Bryant didn't act alone. His half-brother, J.W. Milam, was a larger, more aggressive man with a reputation for violence. Milam saw this as more than just a family matter. He viewed it as a threat to the entire social order that gave him power and status. Together, the two men began planning something that would shock even their own community with its brutality. The conspiracy that unfolded over the next few days reveals the true nature of the system they were defending. This wasn't just two angry men seeking revenge. This was a community that had convinced itself that extreme violence was not only justified, but necessary to maintain their way of life. At 2:30 in the morning on August 28, 1955, Emmett Till was sleeping peacefully in his great-uncle's cabin when the sound of approaching vehicles shattered the summer night silence. What happened next would become one of the most documented and horrifying lynchings in American history, but the full truth of Emmett's final hours remained hidden for decades, protected by a wall of silence and intimidation that extended far beyond the immediate perpetrators. Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam didn't come alone that night. They brought with them others whose identities would remain secret for years, men who helped carry out what they saw as necessary justice, but who would never be held accountable for their actions. The kidnapping itself was conducted with the casual efficiency of men who believed they had every right to take this boy from his family and that no one would dare stop them. Moses Wright, Emmett's great-uncle, was awakened by the pounding on his door. At 64 years old, he had survived in Mississippi by understanding exactly how these encounters worked. When white men came to your door at night, especially armed white men, you cooperated completely and hoped they would leave your family alone. But what they wanted this time was different from the usual intimidation tactics. They demanded to see the boy who did the talking at money. Wright begged them to leave Emmett alone, offered himself instead, tried every form of negotiation he had learned over decades of navigating the treacherous waters of Southern race relations. But Bryant and Milam weren't interested in negotiation. They wanted Emmett, and they were going to take him regardless of any pleas or protests. The kidnapping itself reveals the calculated nature of what was about to unfold. This wasn't a spontaneous act of violence born from sudden anger. Bryant and Milam had planned this carefully, bringing additional men, weapons, and rope. They had scouted locations and prepared for what they knew would be a lengthy process of torture and murder. Emmett was dragged from the cabin still in his pajamas, thrown into the back of a pickup truck, and driven into the Delta darkness. For the next several hours, this 14-year-old boy from Chicago endured torture that was so severe, so deliberately brutal, that when his body was finally found, It was barely recognizable as human. The details of what Bryant and Milam did to Emmett Till during those final hours were so shocking that many newspapers refused to print them. They beat him with whatever weapons they could find. They tortured him with tools designed to inflict maximum pain while keeping him alive as long as possible. They wanted him to suffer, to serve as an example, to embody the consequences of crossing the racial lines that govern their society. But here's the most chilling part. Throughout this torture, they demanded that Emmett beg for mercy, that he admit his wrongdoing, that he promise never to disrespect white women again. When he refused to break, when this child from Chicago maintained his dignity even in the face of unimaginable pain, it only increased their rage and made their violence more extreme. The final act of this horror came when they decided that beating Emmett to death wasn't enough. They wanted to ensure that his body would never be found, that this lesson would remain their secret. They tied a 70-pound cotton gin fan around his neck with barbed wire and threw him into the Tallahatchie River, expecting the weight to keep him submerged forever. But the river had other plans. 3 days later, Emmett's body surfaced, and with it came evidence of brutality so extreme that it would shock even the hardened segregationists who had tacitly approved of the kidnapping. The cotton gin fan was still attached to his neck. His face was so mutilated that identification was only possible through a ring he wore, a ring that his father had worn in World War II. Emmett Lewis Till was born on July 25, 1941 in Chicago to Mamie Carthen and Lewis Till. From his earliest days, he was surrounded by love, ambition, and the promise that life in the North offered to Black families willing to work hard and dream big. His mother, Mamie, was determined that her son would have opportunities that had been denied to previous generations, that he would grow up confident and proud of who he was. Mamie Till had herself been born in Mississippi, but moved north as part of the Great Migration, bringing with her painful memories of Southern racism, but also an unshakable determination to build a better life for her family. She worked multiple jobs to provide for Emmett, often as a secretary and clerk, positions that would have been unthinkable for a Black woman in the South, but were possible, though still challenging, in Chicago's more integrated environment. Emmett was a bright, outgoing child who excelled in school and was popular with his classmates. He had a slight speech impediment, a stutter that made him sometimes whistle to clear his throat before speaking, a harmless habit that would later be twisted into evidence of disrespect by those seeking to justify his murder. His friends remembered him as funny, generous, and maybe a little too confident for his own good. The boy who traveled to Mississippi in the summer of 1955 was the product of an urban environment where racial boundaries, while still present, were far more fluid than anything that existed in the Deep South. Emmett could attend integrated schools, play with white children, and interact with white adults without the elaborate rituals of deference that governed such encounters below the Mason-Dixon line. His father, Lewis Till, had died in World War II when Emmett was just 4 years old. The official story was that Lewis had died fighting for his country in Italy, making the ultimate sacrifice for American freedom. But like so many other aspects of this story, the truth about Louis Till's death was more complex and more tragic than the official version suggested. Mamie had raised Emmett with stories of his father's heroism, instilling in him a sense of pride and patriotism that made him believe America was a country where courage and character mattered more than the color of your skin. This idealism, this faith in American justice, would be put to the ultimate test in the weeks following his son's murder. When Mamie made the decision to allow Emmett to spend the summer with relatives in Mississippi, she was torn between her natural protective instincts and her desire to let her son experience his southern roots. She had left Mississippi for good reasons, but she also wanted Emmett to understand where he came from, to connect with the extended family that still lived there, and to appreciate the progress that had been made since her own childhood. Before he left Chicago, Mamie sat down with Emmett for what she thought would be a routine conversation about behavior and expectations. She tried to explain the different world he was entering, the need for caution, the importance of understanding that the rules in Mississippi were different from those in Chicago. But how do you explain to a confident 14-year-old that his very existence is seen as a threat by some people? Emmett listened politely to his mother's warnings, but it's clear that he didn't fully understand the deadly serious nature of what she was trying to tell him. In his world, adults were generally fair-minded. Conflicts could be resolved through discussion, and the worst consequence for teenage misbehavior was usually punishment at home or school. He had no frame of reference for a society where a single misstep could result in torture and death. The boy who stepped off the train in Mississippi was carrying with him not just clothes and spending money, but the hopes and dreams of a mother who had sacrificed everything to give him opportunities. He represented the possibility of a better future, the promise that the next generation of Black Americans would be treated with dignity and respect. His murder would shatter those hopes, but it would also transform his mother into one of the most powerful advocates for civil rights in American history. When Emmett's mutilated body was pulled from the Tallahatchie River on August 31, 1955, the local authorities had one primary goal: make this disappear as quickly as possible. The sheriff immediately declared the body too decomposed for proper identification, despite the fact that it had only been in the water for 3 days. Local officials wanted Emmett buried immediately in Mississippi, in an unmarked grave that would allow everyone to pretend this tragedy had never happened. But Mamie Till Bradley had other plans. When she received the call informing her that her son's body had been found, she made a decision that would change the course of American history. She demanded that Emmett's body be returned to Chicago, and when officials tried to discourage her by describing the condition of the remains, she became even more determined to see her son for herself. The scene at the funeral home in Chicago was one that would haunt everyone who witnessed it. When the casket was opened, even the experienced morticians wept at what they saw. Emmett's face was so severely beaten that one eye was missing, his skull was crushed, and his jaw was broken. The cotton gin fan had carved deep gouges around his neck, and his body showed evidence of torture that went far beyond a simple beating. Any other mother might have chosen a closed casket funeral, might have wanted to preserve some dignity for her son, and spare herself the additional trauma of seeing him in this condition. But Mamie Till Bradley was not any other mother. She was a woman who understood that this moment, this horror, could serve a purpose that transcended her personal grief. "Let the people see what they did to my boy," she declared, making the decision that would turn Emmett Till from a victim into a symbol. She insisted on an open casket funeral, allowing thousands of mourners to file past and witness firsthand the brutality of Southern justice. Photographers captured images that would appear in newspapers across the country and around the world, images so shocking that many people who had remained silent about racial injustice could no longer avoid confronting its reality. The funeral itself became a rallying cry for the civil rights movement. Over 100,000 people viewed Emmett's body during the 4-day wake, and the images published in Jet magazine reached millions more. For the first time, Americans outside the South could see exactly what lynching looked like, exactly what happened to black children who allegedly violated the racial codes of the Deep South. But even as the nation reeled from these images, the legal system in Mississippi was preparing to deliver another shock. Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam were arrested and charged with murder, but from the beginning, it was clear that the trial would be less about seeking justice than about maintaining the status quo. The all-white jury was selected from a population that saw the defendants not as criminals, but as defenders of their way of life. The trial itself revealed the depths of the conspiracy to protect Emmett's killers. Witnesses were intimidated, evidence was suppressed, and the prosecution seemed more interested in going through the motions than in securing convictions. Carolyn Bryant took the stand and told her story about being threatened and assaulted by Emmett, testimony that would later be revealed as largely fabricated, but which gave the jury the excuse they needed to acquit. After deliberating for just over an hour, the jury returned with not guilty verdicts on all charges. One juror later admitted they would have reached their decision even faster if they hadn't stopped for a soda break. The message was clear. In Mississippi, white men could torture and murder black children with complete impunity, as long as they could claim they were protecting white womanhood. The aftermath of the trial brought one final devastating revelation. Protected by double jeopardy laws that prevented them from being tried again, Bryant and Milam sold their story to Look magazine for $4,000. In the published account, they confessed to the murder in graphic detail, describing their actions not with remorse, but with pride, as if they had performed a public service. They described how they had intended only to scare Emmett, but became enraged when he refused to show proper deference, when this child from Chicago maintained his dignity even in the face of their threats. They admitted to the torture, to the systematic brutality designed to break his spirit, and to their frustration when he refused to beg for mercy or admit wrongdoing. Most shocking of all, they revealed that they had never intended for the body to be found. The cotton gin fan was supposed to keep Emmett submerged forever, making him just another missing person in a state where black people disappeared regularly without investigation. It was only the river's unexpected cooperation that brought their crime to light and forced them to face even the minimal consequences of arrest and trial. The Emmett Till case exposed the complete breakdown of justice in the Jim Crow South, but it also revealed something unexpected: the power of truth to transcend regional boundaries and racial prejudices. The images from Emmett's funeral, the details of his torture, and the shameless acquittal of his killers created a national conversation about race that could no longer be suppressed or ignored. Within months of the trial, a young pastor named Martin Luther King Jr. would lead the Montgomery bus boycott, inspired in part by the outrage generated by Emmett's murder. The civil rights movement that emerged in the late 1950s drew much of its moral authority from the memory of this 14-year-old boy whose only crime was failing to understand that in some parts of America, his very existence was seen as a threat. The case also revealed the complicated role of gender and sexuality in maintaining racial hierarchies. The supposed threat that Emmett posed to Carolyn Bryant was entirely manufactured, but it tapped into deep-seated fears about black male sexuality that had been used to justify lynching for generations. The protection of white womanhood became the excuse for the most extreme forms of racial violence, even when the women themselves were in no actual danger. Over the decades that followed, the Emmett Till case became a touchstone for discussions about American racism, but many of its most important lessons remained hidden. The full extent of the conspiracy that protected his killers, the role of federal authorities in failing to intervene, and the ways that supposedly respectable citizens participated in or enabled the cover-up would only be revealed years later through investigations and testimonies that painted an even darker picture of institutional complicity. In 2007, more than 50 years after Emmett's murder, the FBI reopened the case based on new evidence and testimony. The investigation revealed that far more people had been involved in the kidnapping and murder than originally thought, and that many of those responsible had lived full lives without ever facing consequences for their actions. By then, most of the perpetrators were dead, making prosecution impossible, but finally allowing the full truth to emerge. The most shocking revelation came in 2017 when author Timothy Tyson published The Blood of Emmett Till, which included interviews with Carolyn Bryant conducted in 2007. In those interviews, the elderly woman finally admitted that key parts of her testimony in 1955 had been false. Emmett had never grabbed her, never made verbal advances, never behaved in the threatening manner she had described under oath. This confession, delivered more than 60 years after the fact, confirmed what many had suspected all along. Emmett Till died for a crime he didn't commit, based on testimony that was fabricated to justify an act of racial terrorism. The woman whose supposed victimization had provided the excuse for his torture and murder finally admitted that she had lied, but her confession came far too late to serve justice for Emmett or his family. Today, Emmett Till's story continues to resonate as America grapples with ongoing issues of racial injustice and police brutality. His name is invoked alongside those of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, and countless others who have died simply for being black in America. The methods may have changed, but the underlying dynamic that cost Emmett his life, the assumption that black lives are inherently less valuable than white lives, persists in ways both subtle and overt. The memorial markers erected at the site of Emmett's murder have been repeatedly vandalized and shot full of holes, evidence that even today, there are those who see his killers as heroes rather than criminals. The struggle to preserve his memory and honor his legacy continues, just as the broader struggle for racial equality continues more than 65 years after his death. Perhaps the most important lesson of Emmett Till's story is how individual acts of courage can transform tragedy into progress. Mamie Till Bradley's decision to show the world what had been done to her son required tremendous personal strength, but it also created a moment of moral clarity that millions of Americans could not ignore. Her refusal to let Emmett's death be hidden away, to let it become just another forgotten lynching, turned his murder into a catalyst for the greatest civil rights movement in American history. The archives related to Emmett Till's case remain partially sealed, and investigators believe there may still be living witnesses who have never told their stories. The FBI has indicated that additional revelations about the case may still emerge, suggesting that even now, more than 65 years later, we may not know the full truth about what happened to this 14-year-old boy who dared to exist confidently in a world that demanded his submission. What we do know is that Emmett Till's legacy extends far beyond the circumstances of his death. His story reminds us that progress is never inevitable, that justice requires constant vigilance, and that sometimes the most ordinary people are called upon to make extraordinary sacrifices for the greater good. His mother's courage in demanding that the world see what racism really looked like helped awaken a nation's conscience and sparked a movement that continues today. If you found this story as powerful as I did, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the moments that changed history. Leave a comment below and let me know what you think about how we can honor Emmett Till's memory while continuing to fight for justice today. These conversations matter, and your voice is part of ensuring that